So I thought this is a great time to really delve into relationships. And it is all about the candy and the flowers and a gold bracelet would be nice too. Yeah. Relationships. Joan Chittister, who wrote the book that we're working with, Between the Dark and Daylight, wrote a couple of nice chapters on issues of relationship. So we will be looking at chapters 20 to 23. One of the things that I noticed about this book that maybe you all noticed already, but it just occurred to me as I was reading it, is she has these lovely little vignettes about different parts of our life, and she manages to talk about our life without ever mentioning God. So I was really surprised at that. And she's a very faithful woman. She's a nun and has written many books about God. So I think she was intentional. I think she was trying to probably do a couple things. She was probably trying to reach a wider audience. Because these are little, like, 2.5-page vignettes about life. They're easy to read. And they're separate from one another. So they kind of lend themselves to sort of looking at something in a small chapter. But it also allows for people to experience what the spiritual life is like without the intrusion of the word God, which might trigger some people into shutting down. So I just thought the whole thing was very, very interesting. Because when you talk about relationships, at least for you and me, because we're Christians, we naturally think about God, right? I mean, that's the biggest relationship that we have, a relationship with God. And then it kind of trickles down to our relationship with one another. So I titled this talk today, Love and Loneliness. Real life, real relationships. I love that we're going to start with the idea of loneliness. So we're going to talk a little bit about what it means to be lonely. And then we're going to kind of move into, after we spend some time being honest about loneliness, we're going to move into the idea of friendship. What is the purpose of friendship? What does friendship do? And then finally, we are going to move into the idea of love. Yeah? So that's kind of the trajectory here. So I did a little reflection on this idea, and I kind of wrote it down here. There's this dance that you and I play between connection and separation, between loneliness and solitude, between intimacy and independence. Love and loneliness are integral to the human existence. We are inwardly focused and we're outwardly focused. We seek relationships. We seek to know ourselves. We seek understanding of others. We seek understanding of self. And we long to love and to be loved. And in the midst of all that is God. So, for you, what does it mean to be loved? What does it mean to be lonely? So let's talk a little bit about loneliness. The idea, I think what's fascinating to me is, as I was thinking about this, is the idea of loneliness is universal. There isn't one person in the world who has not experienced loneliness. And if you think of the myriad of the kind of individuals we have people who have, lots and lots of Facebook friends and have just an extroverted party life and everything, and they have experienced loneliness. And then we have the other extreme, somebody who tends to be reclusive and desires not to be in relationship with too many people for whatever reason, and they have experienced loneliness. So maybe one of the things we get to say from the beginning is that to be human is to experience loneliness. And I find that affirmative, I find that encouraging, and I find that truthful. So Chittister was a nun, and she shared a story of her own experience of loneliness in the book, which I'll read to you. I was a very young nun and living with sisters who had been in the community for years, many of them in their 60s. I did not know any of them personally. We had nothing in common, and community customs simply did not provide for any way to make personal connections. It was a very lonely, very desperate kind of time. At that age, at a new point of life, I needed more personal contact than that. I couldn't leave the place. I couldn't change the place. I could only get more and more dour by the day. And the question plagued me. I was surely not the first person who had ever been in a situation like this. So was I suffering from loneliness or self-pity? Clearly, getting through this was up to me. I knew that I had to have a plan. So I made a list of the things I had wanted to do for years, but never was in the right situation to try. Study all of Shakespeare's plays, read all the American musicals, learn to carve leather. That's on all of our bucket lists, right? Of course. So what she says here is she found herself in a very lonely situation, and ironically, of course, we're not surprised by this. She was surrounded by people. And even though she claims that it was because of their order and the requirements and the rules that they had in terms of their interaction with one another, nevertheless, we recognize that sometimes you can be surrounded by people and still be utterly lonely. So her question was, wait, what is this? Is it loneliness or is it self-pity, right? And the way that she distinguishes between the two is you are engaging in self-pity if your response to loneliness is withdrawal or an internal kind of dialogue of where you're just wallowing in your misery. So to her, when you are lonely and you start that kind of woe is me, your little Eeyore comes out and you begin to say, oh, I'm so alone, nobody loves me, blah, 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 and the life is just misery upon misery for you. You are not engaging in loneliness, you are engaging in self-pity. Now, I'm actually wondering if that's a helpful distinction, so I'd love to hear what you think about that. But let's just continue to see what she says. So she shows, what's her answer to loneliness? Well, her answer to loneliness was to realize that she'd been given this gift, right? A gift of time in which she had nobody expecting anything from her, and she can do all this internal work, which is a fascinating way to deal with your own loneliness. And I think maybe some of us have done that, where you find yourself deeply lonely. You've gone through the whole process of saying, why isn't this changing? Why aren't more people in my life? Why am I not having what I really, really want and desire? And you get to that point and you're like, maybe I can use all of this energy and time for something internal, to change who I am, to better who I am, to do the things that I didn't think I could do, like carve leather and read all of Shakespeare's plays. So it becomes this ability to actually transform yourself, loneliness. So she'll say, we can either do nothing about loneliness, or we can look at loneliness as another kind of call to go on growing in ways that take us beyond dependency on others to the creation of life's most important resources within ourselves. Loneliness is a sign that there are whole parts of us that cry for development. We are meant to have inner lives that are themselves rich and satisfying. So, to Chittister, the purpose of loneliness is actually to alert you that there's something that you need to do internally. That you can actually find a way to be deeply satisfied in your loneliness because you've turned inside. I don't know how that rings for you. I've gone ahead and sort of, in my own meditation about loneliness, found that I don't know if that covered everything for me. So I tried to be a little bit more comprehensive. So here's on page 2 is some bullet points on what I think happens when you're lonely. So the first one is what Chittister said. It gives you time to be productive and to develop yourself. And there's a sense that you're almost willing your loneliness away. I do remember one time I was in a situation, a work situation, where I was surrounded by people and I was deeply lonely. There wasn't a connection, everybody else had their own friends and cliques and I didn't belong to any of them. So it was a lonely time. And I remember at one point, after doing my wallowing in self-pity, which was real, then I was like, okay, this is ridiculous. I need to do something for me, right? And so I began to, at that point, what I was really interested in was finding out more about a different kind of ministry, and there was all this research I could do, and I was engrossed. Right? I created a plan, a spreadsheet of what I wanted to accomplish. I had the books printed out, and I had my notes and everything like that, and I felt like I was accomplishing something. And so I literally willed the loneliness away with that kind of action. One could argue I substituted. I don't know. But maybe that's part of it. The other thing that loneliness does is it creates what I call the sacred ground of boredom. Yeah? So because you're lonely and there's almost like nothing to do, there's a sense of boredom. There's a sense of like, I don't know how to fill this. I don't know what to do. And it's sacred ground. When you and I enter into states of boredom, actually that's one of the places where God tends to meet us, if we're willing and listening. Because we're quiet all of a sudden. We're not doing anything. And it occurred to me the other day when I was starting to feel a little bored. And do you recognize that internally? I'm just curious. Maybe none of you are ever bored in life, right? Okay. I mean, I sometimes get bored. And so I recognized that internally, and I noticed what my reflexive action was. This was just a couple weeks ago. Can you guess what I did when I started to feel bored? Eat? I love that. I should have. Yeah, totally. Yeah, we definitely do that. That's not quite what I did. That's it. Yep. I got on my smartphone, right? I had nothing to do, and I was lonely, and I had nobody to talk to, and so I got on my smartphone, and I started. And I mean, it was a total waste of time. There was nothing to it. But I think that technology actually impedes the sacred work of boredom. And if we can recognize that, and maybe with Lent coming up, maybe we habitually can say to ourselves during Lent, we're going to let ourselves sit in the boredom and see what God does. I don't know, that's something to think about, and not let technology get in the way. Okay, so loneliness allows this kind of self-reflection and self-work. The other thing that Chittister did mention was that loneliness actually alerts you that you have a call to care for others. In other words, you experienced loneliness. And your hope was somebody would come and help you feel less lonely, right? Therefore, you know other people feel the same way, and you could be that person, right? So it's kind of a sensibility of like, I know what you're going through. It's hard to be lonely. So it really calls you out of yourself. And it's a wonderful way to deal with loneliness. It's very productive. We're going to talk about friends soon. But the idea that your own loneliness actually alerts you to other people's pain and suffering. Does that make sense? Yeah? Okay. All right. Now, here's the thing. That was all well and good, and I thought that was very helpful in the 2.5 pages that Chichester talked about loneliness. But I don't actually think it quite covers everything. And so I really want to spend a little time talking about loneliness and then look at some scriptural references about loneliness. Loneliness is painful. It's a sense of just being desperate in the fact that it's not you're alone, it's just you're lonely. If you have lost a loved one, especially a partner or a spouse, you understand that loneliness. And there's no going back into self and making yourself better and learning Shakespeare or something. You're just lonely. And you get to sit there. One of the things that the scriptures remind us is that there is no easy way through the processes of human existence. You have to take it step by step by step. So in the book of Lamentations, right? What is lamentation? To lament something that is gone. You're lonely. Person you love is gone. You get to feel that loneliness. So in Lamentations 1, of course, Lamentations 1 is about also the exile of the people, but it uses the metaphor of a widow. How lonely sits the city that once was full of people. How like a widow she has become, she that was great among the nations. She that was a princess among the provinces has become a vassal. Now listen to this. She weeps bitterly in the night with tears on her cheeks. Among all her lovers, she has no one to comfort her. All her friends have dealt treacherously with her. They have become her enemies. So I think that loneliness actually serves a purpose. It allows us to be faithful and truthful to the human experience of loss. There is no getting around this. There's no substitution. When someone is gone in your life, they are gone. And so loneliness is actually very important. Now, if you've done any grief work, or if you studied grief, you understand that is a part of the experience of grief, right? And you stay there. You stay there for as long as you need to and want to, because you honor that sense of somebody missing. So I just think that if that's an experience that you are having or have had or will have, please give yourself space to be lonely. I think the other thing that then loneliness does is it ends up then producing a longing inside of us. Like, why does it have to be this way? Why am I lonely? I can envision what life could be like. I know what would make me less lonely. I can see it. Why can't it be that way? And so loneliness produces holy longing. There's a beautiful time in the scriptures where Jesus is about to go to Jerusalem, and he's about to go to Jerusalem, where he should be lifted up, right? He's the Messiah, right? It's what Jerusalem was waiting for all this time, and yet things aren't quite right. And so he says in Matthew 23, Jerusalem, Jerusalem, you who kill the prophets and stone those sent to you, how often I have longed to gather your children together as a hen gathers her chicks under her wings, and you were not willing. So here Jesus has a sense of what things should look like. You know, he's come to gather everybody, and he expects his little chicks to come running to him and say, yay, it's the Messiah. And yet what do? They kill and they stone the prophets. And so the loneliness that he feels and that he's uttering here shows a longing for how it can be. And I want you to think about that, because that's really important for you to affirm in yourself. When you are lonely, when you say, oh man, it could be so much better, or you're in a situation where you aren't being treated well by the other, and you're like, I can see how this could be, and it's not. That is a holy longing. It's a recognition that we are still not there yet, that we are between the times that Christ will come and make all things new, and live into that longing. Live into that longing. Let it be that which you hope for over and over again. I remember growing up with longing. I longed to have relationships with my cousins who lived way over in India, who I had no ability to connect with. I longed to be in the cool people's group in elementary school and middle school, right? Because I liked them, and why couldn't it be reciprocated? I longed to be recognized in situations where sometimes my male colleagues just didn't pay any attention to me. I knew what it could look like, and I longed for that. That distance that separates you from what can be, I think, is holy. So another purpose of loneliness. Finally, when you're lonely, the funny thing about being human and lonely is that we're human and lonely, and God is fully present there. And I think that's the hardest part to get your head around, yeah? That you are lonely in the presence of God. So this past Wednesday, we had Meeting Jesus here at the church. This is an amazing opportunity, and I'm just gonna be a cheerleader and a fan for it for a moment. Every Wednesday, you have this great opportunity to learn the scriptures, to receive a meal, and to be in fellowship with one another. It's very basic, very simple, very holy, and very, very profound. Take advantage of it if you can. You also do have an opportunity Wednesday mornings to do the same thing at a Bible study with a meal and Eucharist. So Wednesdays should now become sort of habitually the day you come to church, I'm hoping. But so I came to church, and I was blessed because Mother Imogen led us in the story of Jacob. And Jacob, who's just a fun kind of guy, and does all kinds of strange and bizarre things. So there was this moment in Jacob's life in the book of Genesis that he had to come to terms with the fact that he had screwed his brother Esau, and now he had to face him. And he was frightened, deeply, deeply frightened. And he tried to create all these scenarios where he thought, maybe he could appease Esau. But in the end, he had to realize that it was really based on what Esau was going to do and not on him. And so he did this amazing thing. he created loneliness in self. He did that by sending everybody away. He had lots of servants, he had a couple wives, he had lots of children, and he sent them all away. He sent them over on the other side of the river. And he stayed on the bank of the river alone. Now, being alone and being lonely are not the same things, unless when you are alone, you realize that there's some brokenness and you long for something to change. And this is what Jacob wanted. He wanted something to change. So what happens? Well, he wrestles with God. So in his loneliness, he went to God. And I can imagine the scenario maybe in your lives as it is in mine. In that kind of pain, you cry out to God. And you're like, I want this to change. I don't want it to be the same. You need to do something to fix this. And that trust that God is actually hearing you and that God can do something to fix this. Asking for something like that is asking for a blessing from God. And Jacob wrestled with God until God would give him a blessing. So in your loneliness, this is something you can do. Wrestle with God, because God will be there. So I have the story of Jacob here for you. On page 3, I ask you a question, and feeling quite lonely right now because I don't know what you guys are thinking. So let's see if this is a helpful question. How do you handle being lonely? How do you handle being lonely? Does anyone have any thoughts? Or the mic is over there. I'll grab it from you. Thank you. Thank you so much. Is there anyone? Thank you, Linda. Quiet.
I think Chittister is spot on for how to deal with it. Mm-hmm. I mean, I would say that probably a lot of people deal with loneliness just by that, going inward and developing yourself. I think that's much more a woman thing than a man thing, personally. Okay. That men tend maybe, I mean, I may be overspeaking here, to maybe try to find outwardly how to solve it, whereas I think women tend to go more inwardly.
Oh, interesting.
To solve it, and that's what she's suggesting that we do. So, and I think calling on God is the right thing.
Thank you. Thank you. Barb?
I thought of a time in my life when I was, I'm sure, lonely and very stressed. And I think some people at that point, as I was talking with my minister, would have been drinking a lot. And I remember telling her, I just can't read enough. And she looked at me so happy. She knew all the details, and she goes, keep going with that. Okay. Just keep reading.
Good. So keep working on self, yeah. And
I was thinking about, when you were talking.
It is on.
I was thinking about all the people that have pets now, and how suddenly, you know, in the last 20 years, everyone has a dog, and how many pet stores and all the money that's being spent at pet stores. And I have a friend that spends $500 a month in medication to keep her dog alive. So I'm just thinking that pets is a way that some people handle their loneliness.
Beautiful, yeah. That's a great observation, and those of you who have pets probably could speak to that.
I was thinking about your point about technology, and I think social media is a culprit here in some ways, because I think culturally speaking, and I see this in my students, you know, the high school students that I teach, I think a lot of them struggle with loneliness, and it's ironic, because some of the ones that struggle the most with loneliness are the ones who have the most friends on Instagram and, you know, whatever they're into. I think because if those relationships aren't genuine, it can really give you the false promise that you're making lots of connections, but it's at such a superficial level. that eventually, when you have a moment to stop and reflect, you realize, wow, there should be a lot more substance here. And I think, that can enhance our feeling of loneliness, and maybe in a constructive way if we know how to deal with it. But our culture doesn't encourage us to deal with it in constructive ways. We seek distractions rather than really going to the root of the issue. So that's why this is such an important topic for us to think about, because we all experience it, but there's lots of ways that you can shield yourself from the impact of what you're going through and use something else to distract and yeah. So.
Since I'm sitting here, I was thinking, I agree that the self-pity, I'm not sure exactly that's the sort of label I'd come up with, but when I think about how I've dealt with loneliness, what's helpful to me in that distinction is this idea of what is the loneliness that makes me want to be absent. So there's sometimes where I'm lonely and I just want to check out. And I will eat things, Barry, just to eat them, right? And I will look on a phone just to be doing something. Rarely, though, I observe when I'm in that kind of space, will I call someone for a conversation. I will rarely do that. That's not the mood that I want to be in. I want to sort of withdraw in some way. And then there's also, though, I've noticed a loneliness I experience when, and there's no rhyme or reason, I think, about it, but where I want to be more present. And that's what I see as being the helpful turn. That goes from either, if John Chittister calls it self-pity, the one that wants to check out and not be as present to the boredom or whatever the negative feeling is, versus the, right, if I'm going to be truly present and say, you know what, I have a lot of time on my hands right now, I have more time than I'd want, ideally, or I have less, whatever it is, physical or emotional connection than I'd ideally have. And with that being the case, and with me staying in that moment, how do I want to show up to it? And what are the opportunities and what are the gifts that are still there, even as I feel crummy? And there I have acted in ways like, I do more running. I think more about what I'm eating. I plan more of recipes. I cook more. In some ways, yes, you could say I sort of take control over things that I do have control over. But at the same time, I think there can be this divinely inspired sort of reclaiming of one's agency in something, which is never total. It's never control over anything, but often it's also not over control over nothing. And the other thing I would just add is, the other thing I tend to do with myself when I am lonely is to remind myself that it's a season. Because the other thing that can be so oppressive to me is the sense that it is going to perpetual, it's going to be indefinite, unless I do something about it. And I think in my, life thus far, it's tended to more be that there are uphills and downhills. And often I don't have control over when one starts and the other begins. But the reminder that the loneliness that I experience is a season of life and not the whole of it. Even if I don't know the deadline or the time frame that God has. That's another thing that I find helpful when I'm in my right mind to recall.
Beautiful, beautiful. Thank you both. Thank you all. Yeah, just to say one word, or maybe more, that understanding of just going back to Troy and then Mother Imogen, the understanding of high school students actually having this huge experience of relationships and yet feeling utterly lonely is now being documented. And because the suicide rate is increasing. And it's actually epidemic in Oakland County. So this is a real issue. We don't have the capacity to handle loneliness. We've lost that in our culture. And then going to Mother Imogen's amazing reflections on how to actually manage this, and the understanding that it's a season, and that part of it is, the constructive work that we do internally, but also also trusting that God is going to be working through it. This is one of the things that I think you do, and I'm just going to affirm it. Like, the church is an alternative culture. And in the church, we actually encourage you to be in those deep, sometimes awkward relationships with one another and be vulnerable with one another. So I am encouraged to go to my sister Susan and say, man, I'm having a really tough day. And Susan is thus encouraged to recognize that this is a call from God for her to interact in a way that the culture may not recommend or recognize, and say, let me spend some time with you and walk with you and companion with you, right? So we are actually in a counter society in the church that allows us to speak to some of the deepest human issues that we're experiencing. Does that make sense? Take advantage of it. Yeah. Go ahead, Molly. Yeah, that's the other thing. Molly.
Oh, having been alone for the first time in my life this last year. Previous to that, I was always around people, and suddenly I was alone. And I find that inner reflection and journaling is a big help. And then I go back and read what I wrote, and I think, egads, what was I thinking? But there was nobody to listen to me, so I put it on paper. I do talk to the walls, too, and they don't answer, but I hear myself. And then I hear other people calling out to me. I get phone calls from friends who sound down. Well, I make good chicken soup, and it's an excuse to go over and see them, so it helps to be with others who are lonely, and makes me less lonely.
That's beautiful. Thank you, Molly. Thank you. Well, I'm super grateful for this willingness to kind of enter into that space of maybe a little discomfort of talking about the fact that here we are and we're all kind of admitting we're lonely, and yet that there's hope. If it's okay with you, we'll just sort of move on to the next chapter that Chittister saw as the answer, or maybe the next step of loneliness. And in her vision, if you're lonely, you can come to two different conclusions. You can come to the conclusion that you were meant to be alone, and then sort of do the kind of turn to say, not only am I meant to be alone, I am best when I am self-sufficient. So I don't need anybody, right? I can take care of this on my own. And she termed a person who looks at life like that as being fully and wholly independent. She called them a loner, which I thought was fascinating. And the reason she called them a loner is because they actually end up in a space eventually, as all human beings do, because we are interdependent on one another, whether we like to admit it or not. They end up in a space where they need some help. And if you've created a life in which you're fully and wholly independent, then it will be exposed eventually in life. I think about this as we age. That's probably the most easiest way that exposure happens. When you age, you start to not be able to take care of the body in ways that are embarrassing, and hard to deal with, and you need help. I was just talking. We were just talking to my brother-in-law, who said to my sister, he said, "Yeah, then when I get to the point where I can't go to the bathroom by myself, just keep me away from that revolver, because I will just end." The idea of being dependent on another human being to do some basic things about no, please God, no, right? And yet, the idea of a loner, that you're going to be self-sufficient, is a fallacy. You can realize it was something as basic as human, the human body, but you can actually go deeper and realize that you actually cannot experience the fullness of human life without others. So the remedy of that is friendship. So she will say there in the middle of page 3, I quoted her, "There are some things only friends can do for us. Understand our grief, sustain our despair, pick up our load, be a light in our darkness. Without that kind of intimacy and confidentiality, we are left alone to smolder in the pain of it all. We become more prone to try to anesthetize that what we cannot resolve." So I'm curious about this idea of self-sufficiency. I think we are actually encouraged in our society to be independent. And is that a good thing, or is it an illusion? What do you think? Or is it a little bit more complicated than that? Any thoughts about being self-sufficient? Do you pride yourself in being self-sufficient? Do you long? I mean, is that something you try to do, or are you more encouraged as a human being when you're interdependent with one another? Where do you land in all this? Any thoughts?
I'm reminded of the phrase, "People who need people are the luckiest people in the world."
Oh.
And I can remember years ago having a discussion with a friend of mine about that, and she thought, "People who need people are weak."
Right.
I said, "No, I think people who need people are strong." So I think that's what we're saying.
Yeah, that's great. That's a great way of summarizing it. Yeah. I mean, when you admit the fact that to be a human being is to be connected, to be a human being is to actually require relationships, then all of a sudden you're incredibly brave and courageous when you admit that. Yeah. And it's actually maybe a fallacy not to do that. Okay. Well, so from that, she actually helps us with some ideas about what friendship does, and those are written there at the bottom with the bullets. Friends actually help us mirror ourselves to us. So in other words, a friend will tell you something about you that you may not have recognized, right? And sometimes it's great, and sometimes it's not. But you actually need a mirror. You cannot fully know yourself, according to Chittister, without a friend. Now, I think that's fascinating. I think it's fascinating to think that here I am, I've lived in this person for all my life, and I still don't know who I am without the help of Bill. Yeah, it's pretty astonishing to think that. But I think if we maybe leaned into that, maybe that would allow us to open up the kinds of relationships we have. Friends also, this is Chittister again, hold us up as we grow, laughing and playing as we go. So there's a sense of companionship, of course, and then enjoyment with one another. Good friends do that with you. There's a typo here. It should say, friends help us. Friends help us know and accept our deep needs and thus understand and support the deep needs of others. Again, that's the same idea of if you recognize that you're lonely, you recognize other people are lonely too. And so it allows you to have a call to care for others. Friends can actually, if you need a friend, then you understand others need friends. I remember when I was in, maybe it was 8th grade, that, oh my gosh, it's 9:47. I need to stop. So I was in 8th grade, and there was a young girl who came. Nobody liked her. Her name was Celeste, and she was really nice, but she was a little weird. She reminded me of a gypsy. That's how I recall her. She was just kind of weird looking and weird acting and everything, but she was really, really nice. And I sat next to her in science class or social studies, and I would begin to talk to her. And then somebody told me that she came from the wrong side of the tracks, or something was not quite right about it. Maybe she was hanging out with the kids who did drugs or something like that. And so all of a sudden, I stopped talking to her. And I think about that all the time. She's the one who I can't wait to see when we get to heaven. Because I just want to deeply apologize to her. I mean, I completely cut her off. I was cold and rude and awful. We all need one another. And not only do we all need another, we recognize those who are being treated differently. And what a gift to be able to be mutual in your relationship with them. Okay, I'm really out of time, so forgive me. Thanks, you guys, and we'll continue looking at the book next week.